Good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Sarah and I'm the Program and Event Manager at the Reactor in Sydney. Welcome to another Microsoft Sydney live stream event. Today I would like to welcome back David Goad. David is a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of practical experience in information technology, business and digital strategy, including creating his own successful technology startup. His focus areas are using AI and IoT to improve customer experience and drive operational efficiency. Today, he will be talking about AI in finance and managing the risks. This session will be approximately 60 minutes with about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. And I will pop if you just pop your questions in the Q&A box and we will answer as many as we can along the way. At the conclusion of this session, I will share with you a link to our feedback survey, and any feedback would be great. It helps us curate our topics for the future. And if you'd like to reference the session after today, we will be putting that one on YouTube. But for now, I'd like to hand the floor over to David to begin. And David, over to you.
Hi, Sarah. You can hear and see me okay? And you can see the presentation okay?
I can, yes, and I hope my internet didn't drop out too much during that intro.
No, I was actually having some problems on my end. It was starting to echo a bit, so hopefully that's been fixed. And yeah, just if it cuts out, let me know. All right, yep. So hi everyone, my name is David Goad. I'll introduce myself a little bit more fully in a minute, but as Sarah said, the topic of today's session is around managing the risks of deploying artificial intelligence-based solutions in finance. This is actually a replay of a presentation I did back in December to a financial services conference around artificial intelligence. So the agenda for today will be as follows. I'm going to do some introductions of myself and the topic. I want to set the scene a little bit in terms of these technologies and my kind of worldview around artificial intelligence and all these new technologies and the impacts they're having in terms of business and organizations. In order to talk about the risks associated with AI, I think we need to define what AI is. And then I want to get into managing the risks of artificial intelligence specifically. Once I've done that, I'll talk a little bit about some practical learnings that I've garnered from doing AI deployments, and I've been involved in quite a number through my current role at the university, but also my previous experiences as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that and then leave it open for you guys to see if you have any questions. Okay. So just to introduce myself again, my name is David Goad. I'm actually a Microsoft Regional Director, which is slightly different from an MVP. We won't dwell on that. I'm the Chief Solution Architect for the Automation and Innovation Hub at the University of Sydney. I have a PhD in Artificial Intelligence and IoT, but more importantly, I've been working in industry for close to 25 years. I carry multiple different certifications, something on the order of about 15 across multiple technologies, including Microsoft and Google AI. And I regularly run master classes in artificial intelligence to lots of different organizations, including, but not limited to, the Bank of China, New South Wales government, and also the federal government here in Australia. So, one of the key things I just wanted to talk about to set the scene a little bit, this idea of business-driven change versus technology-driven change, right? I think for years, and I still hold to this view that, you know, business needs, business requirements should drive technology needs and technology requirements. But what I'm seeing, and this is not just me that's seeing this, but also Gartner as well, is that over the last few years, you're seeing technology that's now actually driving more and more change. And the reason for that is some of these new technologies, artificial intelligence and IoT, right, are presenting new solutions to old problems that couldn't be solved before, or they're presenting the opportunity to create new business models with these new technologies. And so Gartner refers to this as digital optimization and digital transformation, right? So they say that in terms of a digital business strategy, right, you can have digital business optimization, which is traditional sort of use of IT, right? So this is basically using technology to improve productivity, to improve the customer experience, right? But you're not necessarily significantly changing your business model. These days, more and more, what you're seeing is that technology is actually driving the change and leading to complete new revenue streams, products and services, and completely new business models. And it's really these new business models that are driving a lot of the value from these technologies, right? And so what this leads me to is my next point, which is, and here's a fairly dramatic statement. It's a bit over the top, but you've got John Chambers from Cisco saying, at least 40% of all businesses will die in the next 10 years if they don't figure out how to use or change their organization to accommodate these new technologies. So this is just trying to recognize the fact that some of these new technologies, AI included, being a subset of those, right, can be fairly dramatic in terms of their impact on business and organizations. And really, organizations and people need to really, and the people managing them need to really take a look at these new technologies as they're coming down the track and anticipate them and think about how they're going to affect their organizations. So for me, what this means is that as an executive, working in business, you really have to think about three key questions, right? What are these new technologies? What do they mean for my business, right? How am I going to prepare my organization to adapt to them? And how do I deploy these new technologies, right? And these are questions that senior executives, not just technologists, but also senior executives need to start asking themselves more and more. The uncomfortable truth is that as a business person, you can't just assume that the technology is a technologist's problem. You have to take more ownership of it. And this is one of the themes of my presentations today with regards to artificial intelligence, is that business executives and people who are managing particularly financial services businesses, if they're going to start using these artificial intelligence technologies more and more, which they have been, because they provide opportunities for huge efficiencies and also for new business models, they really need to understand them, because there are issues associated with using AI that can have huge brand impacts on a financial services organization. Okay, so what I would encourage you to take away from this presentation today, if you work in financial services, is just a little bit of understanding, but also a realization that for AI and some of these newer technologies, you really need to dig under the surface and start asking questions. You just can't assume that your technology folks and the partners that they're working with will be doing the right things. You need to start asking some hard questions. So in order to have a conversation about the risks associated with AI, right, you really need to talk about what AI is. Okay, so my next sort of 5 to 10 minutes of my presentation are going to be specifically around what is artificial intelligence. Just checking, Sarah, you're getting good volume and you can see everything okay?
Yep, all good from our end. Thanks, David.
Cool. All right, so what is artificial intelligence? Well, it's not one technology, it's actually a set of technologies. And these set of technologies and different types of math, basically, are designed to make machines look and feel and react more like human beings, right? So they consist, and so in terms of acting more like human beings, they're reasoning, so making conclusions from imperfect data, right? So this is one aspect of AI. Another one is understanding, right? So for example, interpreting human voice, interpreting images, understanding text, right? And interacting with people in more natural ways. For example, conversational agents or the smart speakers that you might have at home that you might be asking to turn on your lights and to do various things with your home appliances. Why is artificial intelligence coming to the forefront now in the last few years? Right? I mean, this is a technology that's been around for years, right? Alan Turing, who developed the first computer back in World War II to crack the Enigma code, right? He was, talking about this idea of artificial intelligence, and hence you get the term, the Turing test that he developed, right, for artificial intelligence. But why now for AI? Well, there's three reasons. First one is we just have more sensors and telemetry. We have, by some estimates, there's more data being generated in the last 18 months than the whole history of man, right? So we have huge amounts of data. And the reality is the more data you have, the better these AI tools work, because they consume lots of data to be able to build the models, to be able to make predictions and make these machines act and look more like humans. The second thing is massive on-demand cloud computing and storage. So in the last 5 or 10 years, particularly in financial services, there's been a huge move to cloud computing, right? Most organizations have been moving to some form of cloud, either public or private. This ability to have large amounts of on-demand compute allows you to apply in a cost-effective manner computations to these large mathematical models that we use to drive these AI algorithms, okay? So the ability to turn on large amounts of compute and then turn it off again makes artificial intelligence more effective. The last reason why AI is becoming to the forefront over the last few years is, simply put, the mathematics has gotten better, okay? So, these two charts illustrate the progress in terms of the way that people sort of manage or monitor how well AI is progressing is by these sort of global competitions where all the AI specialists get together and they compete to see who can build the best algorithm. So the chart on the top illustrates the progress in terms of machine vision, right? So there's an international competition called ImageNet, right? And as you can see, right, over the last few years, the machine vision has actually gotten more accurate than human vision. Largely due to something referred to as a convolutional neural network. You probably don't care about that, but the point to say is the math's gotten better. These machines can actually read photographs more effectively than humans, right? If you look at the chart at the bottom, right, this is about the progress in terms of speech recognition. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that the percentage in terms of accuracy of speech recognition is probably not as good as machine vision. And this is an important point to take away as we talk about the risks associated with AI later on, is that not all AI is created equal. The mathematics is not uniform. The mathematics that you would use to read a photograph is different from the math that you would use to recognize speech, right? And because the math is not uniform and not uniformly advanced, depending on the tool that you use, it may or may not be as good for specific applications. Hence why if you have a smart speaker at home, more often than not, you have to ask it 2 or 3 times before it'll turn that light off for you, because the math and the technology is just not as advanced. Regardless, if you add all these things together, these days you have very cost-effective human-like decision making for very specific applications. Okay, so this is what they refer to as narrow AI. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, what's the difference between general AI and narrow AI. But narrow AI is very much here now. General AI is far off into the future, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, why are people using artificial intelligence? A lot of people think it's because, to automate, repetitive and manual tasks. And this is true, right? People are using, Gartner research has showed that people are using artificial intelligence and other technologies like robotic process automation to automate repetitive or manual tasks. But the more important area that people are using it for is improve customer experience. The whole idea that you can respond to customers more quickly, you can provide them with more tailored offerings, right? This is where financial services organizations are really starting to use artificial intelligence and where they're seeing the benefits, okay? So it's becoming much more about improved customer service than it is just about, automation and eliminating repetitive tasks. What are some of the advantages of artificial intelligence? Well, first off, I just want to point out that we as human beings are just really bad decision makers, right? First off, we're lazy decision makers. There's been lots of research that shows that given the option of either spending more time to make a better decision versus making a quicker decision, we will tend to make a quicker decision, right? The other thing is we tend to use cognitive heuristics or biases. We tend to use shortcuts mentally to make decisions. And these heuristics or biases, even if we know that we're using them, we can't avoid them. For example, if you look at this images here of these 2 tables, right? And I ask you the question, which table is longer? I'm sure most of you have seen this before, right? The reality is both these tables are the same length, but it looks like the one to the left, right, of the image is actually longer. Now, even though I tell you that they're actually both the same length, you'll still look at that image and think, oh, the one to the left is longer. You can't get away from these cognitive heuristics or biases that your brain uses to make decisions. And this is the challenge, right? Even though we know we're taking these shortcuts, right, we still are impacted by the way we think. And the last thing to understand is this concept of prospect theory. So this was a very famous research paper that was done about 20 years ago and won a Nobel Prize, where the researcher proved that, when economists say that, we take decisions and we sort of weigh up the costs and benefits of each decision, right, to come to a conclusion, that's not actually the way we work. We as human beings value losses more than we value gains. So we're more worried about losing things than we are about gaining things. What that means is that depending on how I present the question to you, you'll actually probably make a different decision, okay? And this is some of the things you have to understand. So, not only are we lazy decision makers, not only do we take shortcuts, but we can be heavily influenced by the way people position a question. And so these are things that, artificial intelligence tools are not subjected to. The other thing you have to understand is that as there's more volume, velocity, and variety of data, right, the better that artificial intelligence tools get in making decisions, but the worse that we as human beings get at making decisions. So I'm a member of the Rural Fire Service in New South Wales in Australia, right? I'm a deputy captain. When I did my deputy captain's training, they talked about the rule of 5. There are 5 firefighters to every deputy captain. There's 5 deputy captains to every captain, 5 captains to every group captain, and so on. The reason why the fire service is organized that is because in a high pressure situation, a human being can't manage more than 4 or 5 things in their short-term cognitive memory. Okay, so we as human beings are just not good at managing a lot of data. Hence why we've developed lots of business intelligence tools and reports and all these kind of things like that. The important point to understand here is that AI actually gets better the more data you give it. The challenge you're going to get to, and this is one of the risks we'll talk about in a minute, is when you have scenarios where you have more data than people can reasonably manage, but not enough data to create a good quality AI solution. And this is the challenge you have, is that people will, once they don't have enough data, that data scientists will start making shortcuts, and doing shortcuts is when you start getting into trouble. What are some of the disadvantages of artificial intelligence? Right, well, one of them is training data bias. There was a very famous story of a researcher in the United States that was researching machine vision. This researcher so what they had done is built a tool to be able to recognize people, right? So this researcher put their photograph into the tool, and the tool came back saying that this researcher was an ape. It turns out the researcher was an African-American female, and the data that the AI had been trained on had been older white males, okay? These older white males didn't know that they were imparting their own bias by only putting training data that was, older white males into the tool set. But that's an example where if you put the wrong data into the tool, it's going to make the wrong decisions if that data doesn't represent the area that you're trying to understand, right? So we have biases as human beings, and the unfortunate thing is that we impart our biases onto the machines when we build them, particularly our artificial intelligence tools. Now, the trick there to understand is that if we actually know that we're imparting bias, we can design against it. But the problem that you get into is people don't realize that they're imparting bias. Then there's this negative issue, or there's this issue they refer to as negative feedback loop. This is the idea that if you're building AI tools that are constantly being rebuilt based on the data, that data can create a feedback loop, or it's almost like a self-reinforcing prophecy. So another example is in the United States, they built an AI tool set to allow police departments to be able to figure out where they should patrol, right? So they would load all the data into this AI tool, and it would say patrol this street at this particular time of night, and you'd probably find a baddie. Now, if you think about it, if they're patrolling those streets at that time of night and they find people and then they load that data back into the tool, it's going to self-reinforce what the tool is doing. And what they were finding is that the tool was starting to ask the police forces to patrol certain neighborhoods, and it was considered to be a bit biased in terms of how it was doing that. The other thing, as I said in the previous slide, is that people tend to take shortcuts or proxies. So data scientists, if they're not careful, if they can't find enough data to create an effective model, they'll start using shortcuts and proxies, and they can get into trouble, right? And the other challenge with a lot of these AI tools is they're opaque, right? They're very good at telling correlation, but not causation. You can build a tool that's really effective at making a prediction and therefore make a decision, but you don't know why it's making that decision. And in some cases, that is a problem. For example, if I'm building an AI tool to make a recommendation around, which drug you should take from a medical perspective, it's probably not a good thing. I need to understand why it's making that recommendation, and oftentimes these AI models don't give you that ability to do that. Now, there's a whole branch of science around trying to reduce this opacity to increase transparency in terms of how these AI tools make decisions, but it is a challenge with a lot of these tools. And the other thing with artificial intelligence is that it can create unrealistic expectations. The idea behind AI is that you're using mathematics and data from the past to predict the future. If the past is not a good indication of the future for whatever reason, right, then these tools are not going to be very effective, right, in making decisions. But people don't understand this, and they don't understand the limitations of AI. So they have these unrealistic expectation sets of what AI can and can't do. And this is where business managers get into trouble. If you want a really good book to read, almost a manual on what not to do in terms of artificial intelligence, I would recommend this book by Cathy O'Neill. It's called The Weapons of Math Destruction. Cathy O'Neill did her PhD in artificial intelligence and mathematics. She went to work for a number of large banks and then went out in the industry and consulted. And what the book does is basically go through a bunch of stories where she tells stories of how people have used AI poorly. So it's almost like a manual on what not to do from an artificial intelligence perspective. So I'd highly recommend you have a read of that book to see what are some of the disadvantages of using AI tools. Now, what AI is not, right? What is some of the misconceptions that people have around artificial intelligence? Well, this issue of narrow AI versus general AI, right? So narrow AI is about using artificial intelligence for a very specific application. Right, so narrow AI is very much here and now, right? You use narrow AI, for example, Netflix uses it to make recommendations in terms of which videos you might want to watch. People using conversational agents or chatbots to provide customer service, right? You guys have your home speakers. That's very narrow applications of AI. General AI is where you're using where AI learns from one area and applies it to another. So an example of general AI might be data from Star Trek or C-3PO from Star Wars. The reality is most futurists will tell you that narrow AI is very much here and now, but general AI is probably 30 to 40 years off in the future. And the reason for that is because there's no one universal set of math that can support all different forms of artificial intelligence. And as I said to you previously, the math that you use to recognize speech is different and not as well advanced as, for example, the math that you use to recognize machines or machine vision, right? Photographs. So this is one of the things you have to understand. The other thing about AI is a lot of people worry that AI is about standardization. Really, it's more about personalization. If an AI tool can collect more data, it can provide more personalized offerings, right? And we see this every day. This issue of unintentional bias versus intentional bias, right? So the example I use there is that if you're making a home loan, right, and you're very bad at paying off loans, then it's probably fair to have an intentional bias that says, you know what I mean, that you shouldn't be getting that home loan if you're very bad at paying off loans. But what is not fair is if you have an unintentional bias where, say, the algorithm is making a recommendation for your home loan based on your ethnicity. The challenge you get there is when people, data scientists, don't realize that they're including unintentional bias into these algorithms. For example, one of the things they found in Europe when they were building algorithms, for example, to make recommendations about mortgages and insurance, that some of these data scientists were including zip code or postal code or basically the address of the individual into the model, and they were finding it was contributing to a highly accurate model in terms of you know, whether a person would default on their home loan. Problem is, a person's address is actually a very good indicator of their socioeconomic status and more importantly, their cultural ethnicity. So what was happening is these data scientists were putting in data that was actually biasing these algorithms based on a person's race, which of course we don't want to do, right? So the issue is some bias is good, right, in terms of your decision, but some bias is bad, and you want to understand the difference. The other thing about AI is it's really good at making predictions, but it doesn't tell you why. And this is going back to this comment I made earlier about opacity, right? Correlation versus causation. So you need to understand that these tools are really good for correlation, but not causation. It's funny, as a technology, I've never seen a technology that creates more fear in organizations, right? There's lots of change management issues. The interesting thing here is this is another Gartner statistic, 3/4 of all workers believe that AI will result in net decreases in jobs. Once you've actually deployed it in an organization, that drops down to 1/8, because what people realize is AI is more about, because of the limitations of the technology, it's more about augmentation as opposed to elimination of jobs. And the practical reality is AI eliminates tasks or automates tasks. It doesn't automate jobs. Very few jobs have 100% of all tasks that can be automated, but then the converse is most jobs have some tasks that can be automated. Some definitions in terms of artificial intelligence. So we talk about this idea of algorithmic decision making, a branch of algorithmic decision making. This is using computers to make decisions. For example, we've been using computers to fly our planes. Something like 90% of all air travel is done by autopilot, right? AI is in a subset of algorithmic decision making where it mimics the natural intelligence displayed by humans and make machines look more and feel like humans. Machine learning is a subset of AI where you're using mathematical models based on historical information to predict the future, right? And then within machine learning, there's this concept of deep learning or neural network. So a neural network is a mathematical model based on the way that brain is constructed in terms of neurons and neural networks. And then deep learning is complex neural networks. So these are sort of some definitions that you have to understand. Some people get these confused and don't understand the difference between machine learning versus artificial intelligence versus neural networks. Some types of machine learning that you have to think about. They talk about unsupervised learning, where this machine learning is looking for patterns. Supervised learning, which is the most common, is where you're actually teaching the tool set, and this is where you get into these issues of bias. And then there's this type of artificial intelligence referred to as reinforcement learning. This is where the AI actually teaches itself. I won't go into too much detail around reinforcement learning, except to say that this is not the future. This is actually happening now. There are a number of, for example, mining organizations and manufacturing organizations in Australia that are using reinforcement learning based AI to optimize and run their manufacturing operations. So AIs that teach themselves are very much something that's here and now. Some AI planning assumptions that you need to think about. You know, no one size fits all in terms of artificial intelligence, machine learning. This is why general AI is far into the future, but narrow AI is here and now. Often data scientists have to experiment with multiple different types of models before finding the one that works. So for a lot of people, this can look like a little bit of, you know, magic that's going on, but the reality is it is a methodology. They do have to, it's structured experimentation. And I emphasize that because they should have a method, they should have a structure, right? Oftentimes, once they built a model, they then have to do something called hyperparameter tuning to make sure that the AI works optimally. Other things that I would suggest is don't believe the hype that you hear on automated machine learning. It's a tool that supports and makes it faster to build these AI models, but it only works for certain. It works better for the use cases that people have designed the AutoML for. In a lot of cases, you have to go back to first principles to build a good AI model, and this relies on the skill set of the actual data scientists, which means it's important to have good data scientists and good consultants working to help build your AI tools. Right? Not all vendors are all good at all forms of AI. They might say they are, but they're not. And most of the effort in building a good AI solution is in terms of data preparation. And whilst the tools and tactics that the data scientists can use to efficiently find the right solution, often this can seem more like an art than a science, as I said, but they should be structured. So that is what is artificial intelligence, right? So the question that I have for you guys is, does your organization actually understand what is AI and what impacts it can have? Or as business leaders, do people just kind of go, oh, that's the technologist problem, and they kind of leave it to the technologist, right? And this is one of the challenges I have, is that these business leaders don't understand the issues that can arise from artificial intelligence because they don't understand it. And then you get into issues, and then you get brand impact issues on the organization as a result. Now let's get into the issue. Let's get into talking about managing the risks of artificial intelligence. Now that I've talked about what AI is, right? A quote by Zig Ziglar, right? The first step in solving a problem is to recognize that it exists. Okay, so the first step for business managers in terms of understanding, how to manage the risks associated with AI is to understand that there are risks associated with AI and that you need to do something about them, and that they, as business managers, need to participate in those conversations and not just leave it to their technologists to make those decisions. And AI and the use of AI is this in the industry, it has a lot of concerns. So, for example, the Economist Intelligence Unit surveyed 25 different banking regulators. And the quote was, data bias, black box risk, in other words, not understanding why the algorithm is making a decision, and the lack of human oversight were the three biggest concerns from these regulators based on this survey, okay? So you're finding that regulators in the banking industry and the financial services industry are more and more asking about these algorithms, asking about how you're using artificial intelligence, and trying to put more oversight into it because they are nervous about how people are using these tools, right? So, by the way, Sarah, audio is still okay, video is still okay?
Yep, all from our end.
Cool. All right, so what are some of the risks associated with artificial intelligence? Well, first thing is the AI model, right? I talked about previously this idea of algorithmic risk or bias. The fact that we are biased as individuals and we impart our bias onto the models that we're building. Now, if you understand that you can do this, then you can design against it. The problem that you have as data scientists and the people who are managing those data scientists often miss this issue of bias when they're building these models, right? So and there's lots of tools, for example, that Microsoft and other vendors like Google have developed to be able to identify algorithmic bias. The issue is people have to use them, right? The other issue is algorithmic inaccuracy, okay? So you're asking these AI tools to make decisions based on the data. If the data is incorrect, if it's been corrupted somehow, if the models that are built based on certain sets of data and you're asking it to make decisions based on data that's completely outside this sort of the area that you grabbed historical data from, then it's going to make bad decisions. So people need to understand that the data quality can impact the decisions that the tool sets make, right? There's this issue of feedback or this negative feedback loop, right, which I mentioned earlier, right, feeding data into the algorithm, which leads it to make wrong conclusions, right? And this also issue from an algorithm perspective of people don't understanding that these algorithms, these AI algorithms are limited in terms of their scope, right? They were designed, they have to be designed using certain sets of data to cover certain scenarios. If you're trying to use it outside of a scenario that wasn't envisioned by the data scientist, then the tool set's going to have poor recommendations, but people don't realize this. The technology itself, what are the risks associated with the technology, right? Cybersecurity. I was at a conference 3 or 4 years ago where the head of the business school for University of Sydney volunteered unsolicited that he felt that Internet of Things and artificial intelligence were the two biggest threats to human security. Because if you're connecting everything to the internet through IoT, and then you're getting machines to make decisions about that, right? If you corrupt those decisions, you can actually impact people physically. So it's not just about, being online and maybe, identity theft and losing some money, right? It's now physically people can be harmed, right? And there's stories of, for example, people hacking into cars to be able to fire off airbags. If you're getting these machines to make decisions about people, cybersecurity becomes even more important than ever. Change management, and there's two parts to this change management concept. The first part is, if I'm getting these machines to make decisions based on the data, and somehow upstream of the system, the data gets corrupted because someone in the IT organization changes some fields or makes some adjustments, and the people who build the AI models didn't anticipate this, then an AI model that used to work may now stop working or make bad predictions because the actual underlying data has been corrupted. The other aspect of change management is also managing the change with people to make sure that people understand how AI is going to be impacting them. IT operations, right? So these are not tools that you can basically build and then leave. You actually have to monitor and maintain them, make sure that they're continuing to be work effectively with your legacy things. So you have to make sure that you have some good IT operations to managing these tool sets. Regulation and compliance. Most people are aware of the GDPR regulation in Europe. What less people are aware of is that not only did the GDPR regulation govern the use of data from a privacy perspective, but it also governed the use of using artificial intelligence solutions, more specifically algorithmic decision making. So there was this concept of the right to know and the right to non-discriminate, which has precluded in Europe the use of AI tools in a number of different applications. The GDPR is probably the strongest piece of regulation in Europe, but you have various regulations globally that will impact the use of AI, and you need to be aware of these so you don't get into regulatory trouble if you're going to use these tools. So regulatory compliance is a huge issue. You need to address it up front. You need to understand your privacy regulations. You need to understand what rules and regulations may govern your use of artificial intelligence solutions. For example, in New South Wales, there's a separate act that governs the use of privacy data for universities. So we have separate rules and regulations when we're using artificial intelligence at the University of Sydney than if we were a state government entity versus a commercial entity. So you need to understand this. This issue of culture, right? Like as I said, large-scale adoption, people are very concerned about the use of AI. So you need to manage through these fears and make sure people understand that, right? I think AI as a term is overused, so people need to be careful that they're using AI in appropriate fashion, and they're not just trying to chuck AI into everything. Other risks associated with AI are the people, right? Understanding that you have to have roles and responsibilities. Part of this is getting the business to be more involved with IT when they're deploying these AI solutions, right? And also understanding there's a skill shortage. The challenge that's going on now is because most of the vendors in this space are investing heavily in AI skill sets. They're basically going around and they're offering huge salaries to any of the experts. There was a story in the news last year where a PhD student who just submitted their thesis in artificial intelligence in California got offered $1.5 million a year in annual salary to go to work for one of the vendors. So what's happening is a lot of the expertise from an AI perspective is being mopped up from the universities and from industry and being sucked into the vendors. What this means is that there's actually a general shortage of good data scientist skill sets out in the industry. And you can get yourself into trouble if you don't have good experienced data scientists. And it's not just an experience in the data science, it's experience in the technology they're using to implement these AI tools. And it's actually having the industry knowledge to be able to understand when these machines make decisions, whether they right decisions. So recruitment and skills is a huge risk issue related to artificial intelligence. And the other thing you have to understand that there's a lot of market risk as well. So a lot of the big vendors, Microsoft included, have been going around and gobbling up all the small vendors in terms of AI technology. So what you're seeing over the course of time is a general consolidation in terms of the AI knowledge and skill set. Going back to at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about the ImageNet competition where every year everyone gets together and they compete to see who they can make the best AI tool to read images. Right, 10 years ago, if you looked at who was winning that competition every year, it was mostly the universities. And the last 3 or 4 years, it's mostly the big vendors, the big software vendors. So they're gobbling up, they're sucking up all their various skill sets, and then they're making it proprietary. And so what you're going to find over the course of time is that there's going to be markets consolidation. So you have to ask yourself, if you're making on a bet on a series of vendors from an AI perspective, are you picking the right vendors, or are they going to get gobbled up and taken somewhere else? And then you have this issue with regards to responsible or ethical AI principles that every organization should be thinking about, right? Are you adopting, are you checking for bias in your AI solutions, particularly any ones that are supervised learning? Are you maintaining privacy, right? Are you following all the privacy rules and regulations when you're building these tools? And where possible, are you using what they refer to as explainable AI? There's a whole branch of research around artificial intelligence to actually try to understand why these tools are making the decisions they are. Because if you can't explain why these machines, these AI tools are making recommendations, in some cases you'll be precluded from actually using them. So there's something you have to think about. So some of the things you need to consider in terms of risks, right, when you're deploying your AI solution in the financial services space, right? Have your consultants or technologists have used and been trained in ethical AI techniques? Okay. You should be asking them this, right? Do they understand what ethical AI is, and do they understand the tools and techniques to be able to make sure that they're using AI ethically, right? Do they understand, do the people that you're using, both internal to your organization and these consultants, do they actually understand the impacts of the various regulations they may have in governing the use of AI, making sure that they're compliant, right? Because there's quite a myriad of these different regulations, as I said. Have you done a full risk assessment on the artificial intelligence solution that you're using in your financial services organization, right? And is your delivery team set up to get the full benefits of AI for your organization? These are all questions that you should be asking yourself. So the question I put out to you is, people in the financial services space, is does your organization have the right governance in place for you to move to AI, right? Because I would suggest to you that the governance tools and techniques that you would use for classical IT may or may not be as effective for doing AI type solutions. And because of the ethical implications related to AI, because of all the issues related to AI, you need to have new governance processes and systems to make sure that you don't end up with brand damage because you've used AI in an inappropriate fashion. Okay, so some practical learnings regarding the use of AI that I can give you based on my experience doing it. And I've been involved in literally hundreds of technology implementations and many AI implementations from a number of perspectives: natural language processing, machine vision, these kinds of things. So my suggestions to you in terms of how to be more successful in your AI deployment, right? The first thing you need to understand, I don't know if people recognize this individual. It's a character by the name of Donald Rumsfeld. He's very famous in American politics. He was the former U.S. Secretary of Defense. A few years ago, during the, I think it was the Gulf War, there was a famous speech he made that people made fun of, and it was his speech. You know, he talked about there are the known knowns. These are the things we know. They're the known unknowns. This is to say these are the things we know we don't know. But they're also the unknown unknowns. These are the things that we know we don't know. We don't know we don't know. This became a meme and people made fun of him, but what he was quoting was very well-known American military doctrine. The reason why I bring up Donald Rumsfeld is because there's a lot of known unknowns in terms of, or unknown unknowns in terms of using AI solutions. The challenges related to business case, related to AI, how are you going to use it, how are you going to effectively use it. So you have to recognize that because there's a lot of known unknowns, you have to have an approach that recognizes this uncertainty when you're actually deploying these solutions into your organization, particularly financial services organizations. So you have to have a, test, validate, prove approach when you're building these AI solutions, not just from a technology perspective, but also from a business model perspective, and also from a data perspective. So recognize that there are a lot of known unknowns from a technology perspective, particularly when it comes to AI. So what are the ingredients to success for a good AI deployment? First one is understand the impact of the technology on your business model, what it may have. Adopt a hypothesis-driven approach, a test, validate approach in terms of building these solutions, recognizing the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns. Have some agile delivery, so continue to get feedback and understanding, and apply some what I would refer to as good AI quality assurance. If you do these four things, you're going to have a higher chance of success in terms of your AI project. So, one of the first point I make, drilling into each of these four things in a little bit more detail, I won't go into it, but there's a lot of research that shows that new technology enables new business models, and it's the new business models that create the value. So if you're going to deploy these AI solutions into your financial services business, you have to ask yourself the question, how am I going to have to adjust my business model to get the real value out of this? If I'm going to use an AI to make predictions in terms of home loans, what is the value that I'm going to get out of that, right? There is possibly in that case, for example, a reduction of risk, but probably, as I would suggest to you, a bigger impact would be improved customer service, right? Being able to provide quicker responses to people who are applying for home loans, let's say. That would be a change in business model, right? So you need to have a think about that when you're deploying these solutions. Applying what I refer to as a hypothesis-driven approach, right? A test, I develop a hypothesis, test, then invest more in these tool sets. So recognize that the technology is not that mature, regardless of what your consultants would tell you, right? Recognize that you have to understand how you're going to adopt your business model. Recognize that you're going to have to figure out whether you have the right data set or not, and whether you have good data to be able to make good predictions. Recognizing that AI is very heavily dependent on having lots of good data. right? So you build the tool set, you test it, you see whether it's going to work or not, and then you adjust. Okay. Using this hypothesis-driven approach, avoids a lot of fallacies. Like people will tell you, if I plan a lot, I'm going to make sure that the solution is going to be successful, right? People, like I said, are too optimistic about how these technologies can work, right? And people tend to invest a lot of money into them to make them work. And the more money you invest, the more money they want it, they keep going down that path. So it's better to have an hypothesis-driven approach when you're deploying these types of technologies, right? And this is just a little bit of background around that. The other thing I would suggest to you is these AI tool sets require a lot of adjustment. So rather than using a more classic waterfall approach, you're going to have to adopt more of an agile methodology where you're basically going to understand the requirements, collect the data, build the model, see how it works, and then continue to adjust that model. And so I would suggest to you that a more agile approach is more appropriate to these types of technologies, particularly when you don't know, all the challenges and don't, have all these unknown unknowns related to their use, right? Specifically in terms of AI, you need to make sure you have good quality assurance processes, right? The results of the model should be reviewed by someone who understands the underlying systems to make sure that the results seem logical. So this is what I was saying to you in terms of using consultants to deploy AI solutions in financial services. You need to make sure that not only the consultants understand data science, but they actually understand the technology that they're using and your technologies that you're using, your platforms you're using to make decisions and collect data. They also need to understand your business. Right, so you want to get consultants and data scientists, for example, if you're in the insurance industry, that have background in insurance, so they can, when they build these models, they can actually, look at them and understand when the models are making incorrect predictions. The models should be checked for unintentional biases. I've said repeatedly, this issue of bias needs to be reviewed and understood. You also need to make sure you cross-validate your data. So this is a data science technique where basically you use different data sets to test the data and to validate the data. It's referred to as cross-validation. You need to make sure your data scientists are doing that. And you need to have a feedback loop, not a negative feedback loop, but I was saying, but a positive feedback loop in the sense of you need to periodically check these AI tools because they're relying on the underlying data. They can become more inaccurate over the course of time. So you need to have process and QA processes in place so the tools are being periodically checked to make sure that they are continuing to work properly, that there's no data issues, no upstream issues with the source data, these kinds of things. So it's very much a process that needs to be ongoing from a QA perspective. So these are the ingredients, as I said, in terms of having a good AI deployment, understanding the impact of the technology in your business model, adjusting your business model, having a hypothesis-driven approach, recognizing there's a lot of unknowns, having an agile delivery process to be able to incorporate the data and really validate the models are working properly, and having some good ongoing QA in terms of your tool set. So as I said, when I go and I deploy an AI solution, this is kind of the typical path that I would employ. I would identify the problem. I would say, say to myself, can I solve that problem? And one of the things I would do is I would do a feasibility assessment, make sure that I have the right data, that I have the right amount of data. As I said, sometimes even though you might have challenges and you may have lots of data and people can't manage it effectively, you may not have the right data or good enough quality data to build a good AI tool set. Understand some of the assumptions you make, building an MVP, testing and to make sure it's working properly, make sure the models are working properly, and repeating that process before you do a production and deployment. This is the way that I typically deploy an AI solution. So my last question to you is, does your organization have the right processes in place to manage your AI deployments? Okay, this is something you need to think about because it may not be the same processes that you currently have for your other technology deployments. And that's it for my presentation. If you want to connect up with me, you can use the QR code. My name is David Goad up on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me. These are my details below if you want to send me an email or give me a call. Happy to take any questions. As I said, one of the things I regularly do is conduct master classes in artificial intelligence for organizations. Those master classes can be as short as an hour like this one, or I've done them up to several days. So if you're interested in a master class, please do let me know. But that's it for it. Sarah, were there any questions?
Thanks, Dave. So we've had one come from Mark, but it's in regard to the recording. So we're just letting him know that we're going to publish this one on YouTube in the coming days. I'm just going to put a link to our YouTube channel. Whilst I'm putting those links in the chat box, we'll give everyone a couple minutes just to see if they want to add in any questions there. So there's the link to the YouTube channel and a link to our survey. If you have time to fill that out today, that would be great. It appears that we don't have any questions coming through, David, so I guess you've answered everything in today's presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, everyone, wherever you are joining us from. Have a good rest of your evening, your afternoon, or your morning, and thank you again to David. We hope to see you next time for another live stream event, and you can check out any future events with David on our Microsoft Reactor Sydney meetup page, which I've also put a link to there in the chat box. So thank you, David. We appreciate you taking the time, and we'll see you next time. Have a good night.
Thanks, guys.